For years, people have asked me what the best camera settings are, and for years my answer was, it depends, but start with the 180-degree shutter rule. Well, today is the day I finally answered this loaded question. Let's go through and find out what the best shutter speed actually is. And spoiler alert, it still depends. Starting with a slower shutter speed, let's say like 1/5. I'm not going to get too technical about like what shutter speed is, but shutter speed has a huge effect on the exposure of your camera. The slower your shutter speed, the more light you're allowing to hit the center of your camera, so you'll have a brighter image. This is great for low light static shots, but when anything is moving, we're immediately going to see a ton of motion blur. Another way to creatively use shutter speed at 1/5 is something called shutter drag, and this is great for like insert shots or a creative piece or transitions if you're doing a faster moving edit. If you're slowing down your shutter for either more light or motion blur, make sure you're doing it deliberately and for a good reason, because if you use this at the wrong time, it just screams unprofessional and you don't know what you're doing. If you shoot a talking head interview at 1/5 of a second, the client is probably not going to be very happy. But using the shutter drag effect at the right time is something that takes a lot of creativity to use right, and it can help your shots stand out. You can even slow things down and make them look like they're trailing into each other, or you can use slow motion to make this even more dramatic. Onto the shutter speed you'll most likely be using all the time, 1/50th or around there. From an exposure standpoint, this is a pretty neutral starting point as well. Bright environments may need some ND or like stopping down your lens to get the proper exposure. For 24 or 25 frames per second, around 1/48th or 1/50th shutter speed is where you'll be most of the time. I'm shooting this video using the 180-degree shutter rule, so the motion should be a little bit blurry and have a little bit of like an organic, real life feeling to it. If you're filming something a little faster moving, like running though, I tend to shoot slightly faster of a shutter speed to avoid too much motion blur. Something around 1/100th or even 1/250th if it's really fast. Sometimes I don't want to have too much motion blur on the subject, because if I'm filming something that's very quick, I could miss the action altogether because there's too much motion blur. Taking a second from the shutter speed video to tell you about today's sponsor, Motion Array. Editing is by far the most time-consuming part for making videos, for me at least, and Motion Array helps speed that up. Motion Array has tons of high-quality templates, footage, photos, music, sound effects, and more that you can use in your personal and commercial projects. Motion Array has thousands of different assets, and they break it down so it's easy to find exactly what you're looking for. They have motion graphic overlays, loops, animations, transitions, and more to help you add interest to your videos. There are video templates that help you save time making titles, infographics, logo reveals, transitions, and more. You can also sort video templates by your editor, like Resolve, Premiere, After Effects, and Final Cut. They have collections of stock footage that actually looks good, and the clips come from the same collection, so you can use multiple clips in the same scene. Motion Array also has an automated tool to help you automatically clear copyright issues, so you can remove the headache of copyright claims. To try out Motion Array, you can sign up for a free account to access a limited amount of their assets, or if you subscribe to a monthly or yearly plan, you can access their entire library that you can use in your personal and commercial projects. If you're interested in signing up, you use the link in my description and you'll get $50 off when you subscribe today. Thank you, Motion Array, for sponsoring this video. On to the fast shutter speed here, 1/500th, and when you're shooting real-time footage, this is when it starts to look a little bit overly digital and stuttery, to me at least. Again, if you're filming a close-up of a bat hitting a baseball in 24 frames per second, and you want to show the speed and detail in real time, here is when you want to have your shutter speed a little bit higher. This is also great if you want to make the action seem faster than it actually is. If you watch any fight scene in a recent movie, you'll notice they crank the shutter speed up to make the action look faster than it actually is. I can give you an example here. I may have to raise the ISO a little higher than I would like to pull this off, but just deal with me here. This is 1/500th of a shutter at 5000 ISO, but now it should look very stuttery when I move my hand back and forth, like almost like you can see my hand in every frame. So it looks a little bit, I think it looks a little fake. because in real life, I can't see every frame of my hand when it's moving that quickly. But if we move it back down to, I'm so sorry to be doing this on the fly, but if we move it back down to 1/50th, this will look a little bit more organic and you can't see my individual hands when they're moving. So seeing these two back to back is really what helped me solidify the 180-degree shutter rule and why I should be using that versus the, just cranking your shutter speed when you're filming a talking head interview, for example. Now I'm freaked out that all my camera settings are wrong. In general, using higher shutter speeds are also useful for minimizing motion blur if you know you'll be stabilizing in post. Stabilization is generally, it just looks better and it works better when there isn't a lot of motion blur. Scale and position stabilization can be a cool effect here with a high shutter speed, since the final effect is already a little bit jarring. Leaning into the crisp and stuttery image can make that effect even more noticeable. Just like slowing down your shutter for that shutter drag effect is a tool, high shutter speed is another tool to have in your pocket. However, if you're going to be shooting a sit-down talking head interview and the subject moves their hands a lot when they're talking, like I do, it's going to be very distracting if you have a high shutter and it'll just look like you forgot your ND filter and you had to crank your shutter up to compensate for the exposure. Don't ask me how I know this. Choosing the right shutter speed isn't always as easy as just setting one setting, like 180-degree shutter, and just forgetting about it. It depends on how you want your footage to look and what your final image really calls for. Mixing all three of these shots in the same film can really show off that you understand shutter speed and when to use each kind of shot, provided you actually know when to use that shutter speed, because if you use these incorrectly, it can make you look like you don't know what you're doing. So really understanding this can make your work stand out from other people's. That's all for this one. I know it was kind of a loaded topic. If you're interested in some more videos, I'll leave some on screen now. And thank you guys for sticking around, and I'll see you in the next one.